Neutral is a place of no movement. It means you're not making progress towards the goals or the ideas that are really important to you. Welcome to Beyond Neutral, where we talk about what gets you stuck and how we can shift and navigate the road forward. As leaders, as professionals in our careers, or just balancing and creating the kind of life you desire. I'm your host, Paula Reed. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to today's episode of Beyond Neutral. I am excited about this topic I have to talk to everybody about today, so I'm glad you're joining. Thank you. We've spoken a lot about emotions over the last several episodes, and I've done quite a bit of work around a tool that I have come to know that's called a WEI profile that really looks at how we respond, what our internal emotional response is under stress in a relationship, and how that kind of shapes the way that we approach a relationship and the behaviors that we bring to relationships. And it's a fascinating topic, and I found it to be really beneficial, like in my own self-assessment and my own self-awareness about how I approach relationships and respond to conflict and all of that. So it's kind of led me down this path. And the topic that I want to talk about today is emotional endurance. And I found this term when I was researching, and I found an article that was written by Nick Wignall, who is a psychologist and he's a writer. And he wrote this article, and I thought that there were so many phenomenal points that he made in this article that I wanted to share them. So emotional endurance, what is that? Well, when we think about what physical endurance is, physical endurance is we do weightlifting, we build strength, we try to be able to be stronger, we might try to be able to run longer or faster, exert ourselves longer, right? That's what physical endurance is. And we do all kinds of training in order to keep ourselves in shape around that. Well, emotional endurance is basically the same thing, but it's around our emotions. Emotional endurance is basically our ability to sit with distressing emotions or difficult emotions over a period of time. And you might think, why would you possibly want to do that? Like, how can that be beneficial? But the reality is it's incredibly beneficial. I'll give you some prime examples for that in a moment. So let me back up. We as a society tend to not encourage people to express or be in distressing emotions. So if you think about sadness, how many times have you had a conversation with somebody and you've either expressed your sadness and they've expressed their sadness in any way, and our immediate response is to try and make them feel better. Oh, you shouldn't be sad about that. Think about all the great things you have, right? You immediately try to move them out of emotion, or we immediately try to move ourselves out of emotion. Coping mechanisms. We are about trying to move us from that feeling that we're having, that distressing feeling that we're having, and to move us out of it. And as a society, we tend to want to move ourselves out of the emotion. Now, remember that emotions were evolved in us as a way to give us information. A lot of them evolved to protect us, or to have us take an action or to create a behavior. They're there for a reason. And so experiencing them matters. And being in that experience is how you really get the greatest benefit from them. So emotional endurance, what we're coping, what I mentioned earlier, coping is about an attempt to really immediately lessen the symptoms of an emotional experience, if you think about what coping is. And there's all kinds of times and places where we need to cope. If you're experiencing sadness, there's plenty of places where you don't want to suddenly be overwhelmed with tears as a result of experiencing that sadness. If you experience anger, there's many situations where it's beneficial for you to dial down that anger and to take some steps to kind of get you through that immediate response that you're having, that physical response that you may be having to that emotion. There's many reasons why you would want to have good coping skills to be able to kind of get through that immediate situation. The challenge is that when we do that, and we do that consistently, Remember that emotions are there as a message for us. And so when we immediately experience when we experience a distressing emotion and immediately try to move beyond that feeling, the signal that we're basically sending to our brain is it's a bad thing to feel that way. It's not good to feel that way. You don't want to have that feeling. You don't want to have that sensation, right? And we teach ourselves over and over again. Every time we do that, we repeat and reinforce that pattern of moving beyond that feeling, that sensation. And in moving beyond it, we never give ourselves the opportunity to learn what it's trying to teach us, nor do we give ourselves the opportunity to break the pattern of reacting that way or responding that way. So that is why emotional endurance, as Nick Wignall outlined in his article, is such an important skill to develop and such an important muscle to exercise. So the ability to stay within a distressing emotion becomes really important because what you're trying to tell yourself is that emotion that you're feeling is just a symptom of something that you need to dig into in order to understand and be able to process and evolve from, perhaps, right? So, a primary example of that is the challenge that many of us have in having difficult conversations. How many times have you known that you're going into a difficult conversation? And, you get that feeling of dread, and it's a tough feeling, right? It's a feeling of discomfort, of anxiety that comes up from perhaps the conflict that's going to ensue from that. And so you tend to just like get into that conversation. You want to get in and you want to get out because the thing that you're thinking about the most is not wanting to feel that distress because you're not used to feeling it. It doesn't feel good and you're not used to it and you haven't built up the ability to kind of sit with that distress and be comfortable in that distress. And so your tendency is to dive into the conversation and get yourself out as quickly as possible. What you lose in that moment is because you're so quick to want to remove yourself from that sensation, that feeling, you lose the opportunity to sit in that difficult conversation and hear what the other person has to say. You lose the ability to be connected in that conversation, to be connected to what that other person might be experiencing, what the other person might be feeling. You're losing your opportunity to perhaps learn something about a situation that you didn't know before. And you're losing it because what is the overwhelming driver is trying to get that feeling to stop. So by building an ability to just experience an emotion, to just experience that uncomfortable feeling and to sit with it, you develop your ability to stay connected in a relationship or to stay connected with what's happening there, even if it's just yourself, even if your emotion is sadness. Sadness is the classic one that we all try to just move beyond. But if you just move beyond it and don't experience it, a lot of times it gets pushed to something else. It turns into anger or it turns into anxiety because you haven't dealt with the fact that you're sad. You haven't acknowledged, I'm sad. I'm going to feel sad. I'm going to allow myself to be sad. And I'm going to understand what this sadness is in order to be able to process through it and not allow it to have the impact that it's having on me going forward. And the only way to get through that is to process it by feeling it. Okay. The analogy that I made to developing physical endurance is the same thing. If anybody's taken yoga, I mean, yoga is for me, I love it and I get to the point where I really like it, but there's a lot of pain for me in yoga. And what you don't do in yoga is you don't pull back from the discomfort. Yoga is, in many ways, sitting in the discomfort of trying to lengthen and elongate and strengthen your muscles, right? You sit in a pose and you breathe through the pose. You don't get to the pose and then quickly pull out as soon as you can. Because if you do that, you're not getting the benefit of yoga. That's an example of how we sit with discomfort as a way to grow, as a way to evolve. The emotional discomfort is the same exact thing. So, going back to that example of an uncomfortable conversation, okay? The thing that you have to teach your brain in that situation is that the discomfort is not going to kill you. Building emotional endurance is all about realizing that that emotional feeling that you have is not danger. Having that emotion, experiencing that emotion itself, that distress, is not necessarily going to kill you, that feeling. It's just going to feel crappy. But if you sit in it long enough and you allow yourself to feel it and you allow yourself to be comfortable being uncomfortable for longer, then you can put yourself in situations where you can learn. You can either learn about yourself, you can learn about your own experience that you're having with something, or you can learn about what somebody else is experiencing because you're willing to sit with them in your own discomfort and grow as a result of it. Emotional endurance, phenomenal concept. And I experienced this myself. I traveled 2 weeks ago. I was having massive anxiety about traveling. And sometimes I do. Sometimes I have anxiety about traveling. And rather than just recognize, you know what, I'm having anxiety. This is an anxiety moment for me. And doing the things that I know I needed to do that were the very things that would take away that anxiety, which was the work I had to do before I traveled, the calls I had to make, the things I had to organize, all of those things I needed to do. Okay. Doing those would, in fact, alleviate my anxiety. The challenge was I stepped into that and didn't want to feel the anxiety. So I tried distracting myself from it. And in the process of trying to distract myself from it, I could not keep a thought in my head. Okay. Because anxiety for me shows up as incredibly distracted, short tempered, lack of focus, lack of concentration. And those are the symptoms of my anxiety. Once I just got to the point where I said, you know what? I'm anxious. I am feeling anxiety, and just accepted the fact that that's how I was going to feel. My ability to operate more clearly was tenfold. Tenfold. I didn't feel good operating clearly, but I slogged through it. And that's really what emotional endurance is. Emotional endurance is about feeling the discomfort that you're having, but going forward anyway. Being in that yoga pose, but staying in it and breathing in spite of feeling uncomfortable. Having that difficult conversation, feeling really crappy and being anxious about doing it, but sticking with it and listening and hearing and putting yourself in the other person's shoes and seeing things from a different perspective. That's what emotional endurance is all about. In order to do that, you've got to be willing to just feel what you feel. Remember, emotions aren't right or wrong. They are. They just simply are. And the only way to settle yourself and to understand how they're impacting you and where they're coming from is by experiencing them. So that's the topic of the day that I wanted to share with you. If you're out there and you're on a fitness routine of strengthening your core or learning how to run faster or having greater endurance so that you can hike higher mountains, whatever that is, and you're really training that physical capacity, take a step back and think about how you're training your emotional capacity. What are you doing to ensure that you're able to experience your emotions in the way that you need to experience them in order to learn what they're trying to teach you? Because trust me, there are lessons from that. Okay. I know what my lesson from travel anxiety was. And hopefully by sitting in it, I will now be able to tell my brain that I don't really need to be afraid of the anxiety around that. I just have to accept that sometimes that's how I feel and process through it in order to not feel it anymore. That is my discussion of the day. I hope you have a great day. And if this topic is something that interests you and you'd like to talk further about it, certainly research the articles that I mentioned that I had read, and there's a ton more out there. And I know that at the end of Nick's one of his articles, he talks about other references you can look at, but I wanted to share that with you because I thought it mattered. And it matters in being able to grow and learn and do the things that we need to do in order to move ourselves forward on whatever path or whatever journey you're on. So, story of the day. Hope you're having a good one. Keep driving. Take care. Thanks so much for joining us on this week's episode of Beyond Neutral. Make sure to visit our website, www.reidandco.com, for this week's show notes. That's REIDNCO.com. And if you found value in today's episode, I would really appreciate you giving us a rating on Apple Podcasts, or better yet, share it with a friend. Also, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. All of this helps to support the show. Thanks so much. Take care.